You have got to be fucking kidding me! The leading soldier of Zishiji's security detail commented, as the secure formation surrounding the councilman finally just about reached the nearest airlock that was supposed to allow them to take a shuttle up to one of their ships and escape this powder keg of a station. Lo and behold, for the first time since all of this insanity has started, there were actually signs of life of the station's local security. Which in this case meant that they had seemingly completely blocked the area around the airlock off in a quite fortified perimeter that used propped up fences and tight steel meshes to establish its boundaries. Just looking at it from the outside, it wasn't easy to tell exactly what had gone down to lead to this point. However, two things were clear. One, this whole thing had to have been put up at some point after the human military had transported some of their heavier weapons onto the station in support of the Admiral's rescue efforts. And two, the people around, despite high tension and boiling emotions, were keeping a certain careful distance to the perimeter. Considering that some of them are being ready and willing to get themselves shot against the human soldiers moving through the station, that meant that said perimeter was likely quite aggressively enforced. Self-serving, spineless little... the human went on with a quiet tirade. However, Zishidi interrupted her with a lifted hand. Save your energy, he suggested, and look alive, lest they think we aren't in a hurry. The soldiers all nodded and stood up a bit straighter, the Miat specifically sticking especially close to his councilman as they all together walked towards the perimeter. Zishidi's ears stood up straight and widened as much as they could, directing themselves right towards the defensive line. Miat hearing was often underestimated, and he was ready to make use of that as the local security forces closest to the approaching group began to react to them, mumbling to each other. They don't look happy, a Pethar's Ice Guard said to a Zanhathai, attempting to be quiet and failing miserably, despite the quite intense ambient noise of the station and chaos. Nobody looks happy right now, the large avian replied, ruffling his feathers a bit as he directed himself towards the approaching group. Maybe we should rethink the confrontational approach, the Pethar's Ice whispered, as he turned his quite rotund body as well. I mean, they are heavily armed. The Zanhathai scoffed and loudly clacked his beak. If they have nothing to hide, we have nothing to worry about, he explained simply, his eye keeping tight watch over the approaching group. Although he held his weapon in hand, he did allow them to come closer, unrestrained for now. And if they do? The Pethar's Eye said with mild intensity, almost as if he really assumed that his comrade may not have thought of that before. Then we'll make sure they know that they won't be getting through here, the Zanhathai replied with conviction. The purple plumage covering his chest puffed out, making the already large man appear even bigger, though it was utterly obvious that it was all plush, no sustenance. The two guards quieted down once the approaching troop of Deathworlders stepped into a distance in which they assumed their conversation would be overheard. This, in turn, gave Zishidi a couple of steps to wonder just what they had been whispering about there. Something to hide? What exactly would they be hiding? He would have liked more time to contemplate. Sadly, they were under quite the strict limit of just that. And so they simply kept approaching, careful to not accidentally catch the attention of some of the rioters on the last few steps. Make way! The human leader of the councilman's guard, now calmed down a bit but not entirely, called out with some definite displeasure in her voice. We need to get Councilman Zishidi out of this chaos. The soldiers parted ever so slightly to reveal the person at their midst, as if the giants would have any trouble looking right over their heads to see exactly who was approaching there. This, in turn, caught the attention of more of the local security forces, who were guarding the impromptu fortifications. Though, for the time being, it seemed like they would leave it to the two closest ones to actually deal with this, even if many a nervous glance was thrown in the council member's direction. Shaking his head for a moment while the feathers on it stood up straight, the Xanathai stepped a bit closer to the fence, almost pressing up against it, which in turn rendered the weapon he held in both hands quite useless. I'm afraid I can't do that, he said, as he turned his head so one of his large yellow eyes could slowly scan over the entire group. The current situation has led security to prohibit the travel of certain demographics. Zishidi's ears twitched a bit as he heard the distinct clacking when the human soldier's teeth collided with each other, leading her next words to be spoken through the barrier of the clenched weapons. Demographics, she asked, her voice sharp as a razor's edge. This is an elected councilman of the Galactic Council we are talking about. What kind of demographics exactly do you believe him to be a part of that would give you the gall to think you could force him to stay among this chaos? There was a gentle clicking of metal and groaning of leather as the grip of the human's hands on her weapon tightened inadvertently. Upon her question, the Pepthauses unsurely glanced over towards his avian colleague, his many nostrils flaring and narrowing in nervous sniffs, as he very clearly doubted the wisdom in challenging that sort of declaration. However, the Xanthai himself seemed unperturbed, apart from the feathers on his arms now also spreading out slightly. Even a councilman's authority does not exceed that of station security during an emergent situation, he stated firmly, his pupil narrowing to a pinprick as it settled on Zishadi. And with the ongoing unruliness of predators and other carnivores on the station, a decision has been... Unruliness of carnivores! The human soldier interrupted him, and despite her clear irritation, she honestly sounded less confrontational, and more like she genuinely believed she didn't hear him right. You think the carnivores are the problem? The Xanthai flinched briefly upon her interruption, and his face darkened a bit as he glared down at her. Then, though in a more stern and now annoyed tone, he continued as if he hadn't even heard her. A decision has been made to temporarily block travel of anyone belonging to that demographic, he said, putting extra emphasis on the words that had previously been cut off. Zishadi could hear the teeth of the human grinding against each other as she glared up at the avian with deathly glare. You cannot be serious, she said, her previously disbelieving tone now turning cold. We already have one council member in the hospital, and now you want to go and block another one from leaving the station while there are marauding packs of hooligans roaming around who have every intention to hunt down and assault as many carnivores as they can find? The Xanthai released a strange, almost vibrating clicking noise from his chest and leaned even closer, his face now very nearly touching the metal mesh of the fence. An attack that was conducted by your people on your people is not a reason to lift the rules for more of you, he said, his voice taking an almost spiteful turn as his beak opened so wide that it actually scraped against the fence. Especially not if one can't help but notice that all of this chaos fits directly into your modus operandi. The human was about to reply, but she shut her lips and gave a look of surprise as Zishadi suddenly appeared at her side, having quietly taken a few steps forward to face the Xanthai more directly. What are you implying? He asked directly, gesturing for the soldiers to stand back as some of them twitched forward to get between him and the armed Corewolder. The clicking noise repeated itself as the large parrot glared down at him. Attacking detention centers to target your political enemies where they have no chance of fighting back is exactly how you have already conducted yourself in the past, he responded, his voice lowering in a clear challenge. Did you think we wouldn't make the connection because you were more sneaky this time? Zishadi scowled. Targeting detention centers? Surely he didn't mean the Admiral. Was that perhaps the reason the people were so riled up? Has something happened to the old turtle by chance? Should he inquire further about it? It is well understood by now that the attack on the detention center on Net Narrator station, he began to rebuff, deciding that took priority over trying to find out what exactly the accusation was right now. But now it was him who got cut off in the middle of his sentence. Was conducted by members of your species, the Xanthai cawed, and glanced over both Miat and Human with clear disdain. We have all seen the recordings. Goriva, the Pepthauses whispered to his colleague, clearly trying to snap him out of whatever tirade he was going to go on, while nervously shifting his weight from one thick leg onto the other. However, the flighted Corewolder apparently had no interest to listen to the moderating voice of his comrade. They may have been our conspecifics, Zishadi retorted calmly, not allowing himself to be dragged into some screaming match, even as his interlocutor raised his voice. But we have signed and recorded confessions of those actually involved, that's sure. Goriva flapped his wings in indignation, cutting Zishadi off once again, though this time through the loud rattling of the fence, as his wings smacked against it, which in turn pulled even more attention of the other security onto them. Confessions that you got alone, locked away, from prisoners who are likely under your command, the giant bird chided. Confessions that were recorded by Koivari soldiers, when the perpetrators were apprehended on Geralitan, the leader of the human soldiers corrected, aggressively. The Xanthai simply huffed smugly in return. Where conveniently no one is alive anymore to consolidate that statement, he stated, with the confidence of someone who had not doubted himself since primary education. That statement was ridiculous enough to make some of the humans glance at each other. "The attack on Geralitin was conducted by rogues of Dietos forces," the human soldier explained, her tone very much indignant. "Not even the Dietos are denying that fact." "Koriva!" The Pethalses tried again, now whispering a bit more incessantly while glancing behind himself on occasion, though his attempts remained without success. "The main attack, maybe," the Xanathai conceded, but then leaned even further down, tilting his head even more to look as directly down on the Deathwarders as he could. His large eye alone was almost the size of a human's, or Mia's whole head, and the looming yellow orb was cast in shadow by his white head as his gaze zeroed in. "But your people killed Koivri in that facility. Were they rogues of Dietos too?" "They were attacking survivors!" the human protested, and took a step forwards towards the fence. The Xanathai's pupils constricted even more as he saw her approach. "According to you," he said coldly, as his feathers stood up even higher. "Koriva!" his colleague attempted one last time, now actually reaching out to try and pull the bird away from the fence before anything else could happen. However, the Xanathai shook his hand off. His beak opened as he prepared to say something else. However,
"That's enough!"
a deep, rather booming voice announced, quickly pulling everyone's attention onto his owner. A large himplod, tall enough to tower over most of the other giants, slowly lumbered over to the unfolding scene. The Pethalses quickly bowed his head slightly and hurried a few steps backwards to make way, while the Xanathai looked up at his apparent superior rather unhappily. The himplod's boxy head tilted a bit, his small eyes narrowing in sternness as he returned the avian's gaze. The staring contest lasted only for a few moments, before the Xanathai eventually lowered his posture and stepped aside as well. Giving him a "that's what I thought" kind of look, the himplod then moved to stand right behind the fence himself.
"I'm sorry, Councilman,"
he said, addressing Zishidi directly, while his short round ears waved on top of his head.
"With all due respect, our orders are clear. We are not to allow travel to any carnivore."
"Well, with all due respect, that order is a steaming load of shit," the human soldier intervened, taking another step towards the fence, and one away from professionalism. "It's clearly not the carnivores stirring up trouble. Forbidding them from removing themselves from the situation while this damn lynching is going on is—"
"My orders are clear,"
the himplod reiterated firmly, very clearly implying that his hands were tied, and that they would all have to live with that. But clearly, the human wasn't going to. "Then screw your orders," she exclaimed with another step. "You know they're bullshit, I know they're bullshit, so let's call it like it is." Now the himplod's face darkened a bit.
"Ma'am, please step back from the perimeter," he said in a commanding voice. "I cannot decide which order I follow based on how much I like them."
"Of course you can," the human immediately rebuked, and didn't make any motion to step back as ordered. "If what you're told to do is obviously bullshit, it's your fucking duty to say, 'No, I'm not fucking doing that.'" The himplod's eyes narrowed even more.
"Step back," he repeated.
With her mouth very clearly already opening to reply with a firm no, the rebuff became stuck in the human's throat when she was gently pulled back by Zishidi. The councilman's tail was firmly swaying, and even as he just gently held her shoulder, his claws were extended, as he looked up at the colossal ungulate. "We have orders too," he said, his voice much calmer than his demeanor, as his green eyes zeroed in on the giant with predatory precision. "Likely hostile ships are incoming towards the station. If I remain here, my life would likely be in danger. Are you saying there are no exceptions made for life or death situations?" The himplod's thick lips wiggled a bit as he took that in.
"Those ships are coming to help us enforce order," he replied. "You have nothing to worry about."
Zishidi's ears began to fold back a bit. "I find that hard to believe, given that the council was not informed," he replied, his voice turning colder. 300 warships for a single station?
"It is the council station,"
the himplod tried to defend. "A council that was not informed," Zishidi reminded immediately. Zishidi's ears twitched a bit as he picked up on a noise that was quiet now, but rapidly getting louder. The himplod seemed slightly taken aback for just a second, but then quickly built himself up again.
Due to imminent danger, it was imperative that information be held discreet, lest certain council members...
So you deem to keep council members in the dark, most likely to detain or even arrest them upon the arrival of your perceived reinforcements? Zishidi questioned, his tail swaying increasing. You are planning to take control over the station? Deny the council its rights given by the people? Why not arrest me right now? Is this imminent danger not imminent enough to do so? The hemplot shifted again, stepping from one thick leg onto the other. The noise became even louder, and with it, Zishidi's boldness grew, at least for the moment. If certain members of the council were the concern, does that mean the rest of the council is aware? Zishidi continued his questioning. Now that you got me here and in your sights, and we are all already aware of the incoming ships, why don't you tell me which council members are under suspicion? Then I can call one of the others and hear that they have been informed. Now Zishidi began to walk towards the fence, and although he vastly outscaled the Deathworlder to an almost ridiculous degree, the Hemplot security officer recoiled a bit. Has Councilman Aldwin not complied with his arrest without question? Zishidi pressed on even further, the sways of his tail becoming longer and more lavish. What reason do you have to believe there is an imminent danger that others would not do the same? Finally, when he reached the fence and stood so closely that his breath was cut apart by the metal mesh, he stopped. By then, his head was almost all of the way back in his neck to still look up at the security officer. What's the matter? He questioned, playing his accent up even more than his usual state, as the Hemplot recoiled another step away from the Deathworlder and simply stared down at him without replying. Cat got your tongue? The Hemplot stared for a moment longer, clearly trying to pull himself together.
You're taking this all vastly out of context,
he stammered, and finally shook his head to try and regain his composure.
We have orders. We are to wait for...
Suddenly his eyes widened, turning upwards as he saw something in the metaphorical sky. Zishidi's ears stood up straight, taking in the deeply satisfying buzzing of the flying envoys of death as they arrived on the scene, immediately beginning their widespread circling above. I do not plan to wait for anyone, Zishidi explained, a smirk forming on his lips as more of the local security began to stare up at the drones. He lifted his hand, hooking his fingers into the fence's metal mesh so that his claws could poke out even further from the tips of his fingers against the pressure. I am willing to face any scrutiny or suspicion, he stated dryly, but I will not be ambushed, not after a ship dropped on my head. If you are not arresting me right now, arresting me cannot be what you want. Whether that is your idea or not, I do not know, but it doesn't matter. Your orders make you compliant. Arresting him before the reinforcements arrive would put lies his way. It would mean lawyers, processes, news media. Even in all this chaos, it wouldn't take 5 minutes for all the galaxy to have its eyes on an arrested councilman, especially if it was one of the Deathworlders. That story was too juicy to be passed up, especially since the humans would surely apply a little pressure. Whatever they were planning to do, they needed their overwhelming force, and they needed it immediately. Ideally, they needed it before anyone was any the wiser. Zishidi began to see through it. The playbook of himself and a Veslon hadn't been extremely different in some places, even if it never reached the depths of such depravity. They needed the guise of this riot, the confusion, the anger. And when the time came, they needed the people they gunned for not already detained, not behind bars, not long rendered harmless. It is treason, he mumbled. Reacting to his words immediately, both human and Miet soldiers instantly raised their weapons, pointing them towards the security long before any of them had a real chance to react. Zishidi removed his hand from the fence, confidently turning his back to it, while the off-worlders were left to ponder if they should try to return the Deathworlder's threat or not, though the circling psychopomps did put their metaphorical finger onto the scales there. Though, even if the people were not going to offer much of a resistance like this, that didn't mean the structure wasn't going to. Usually a Veslon would have surely been able to take control and open it for them, but right now his old friend was in a strange state of mind. And if the ones with control over the station would not let them pass, they would need eyes on them, as many as they could get. The councilman lifted his gaze as he looked in the direction of another approaching group that was now finally catching up to them. Admiral Krieger looked back at him as she approached. The look on her face heavily indicated that she was already smelling trouble. Wait, is that? Admir quietly asked himself. However, his thoughts were interrupted by a loud sound of displeasure that was pressed out of a tightly held trunk.
Nafmir Durulfren.
The Satytos next to him, also Nafmir Durulfren, growled quietly as he spotted his fellow Colossus off in the distance. His entire body tensed at the sight of the other ball, almost as if he was readying himself to charge the man immediately. Admir glanced up at the familiar Nafmir for a moment before his eyes shot right back to the less friendly version. In his head, he decided to drop the Nafmir prefix for his Durulfren for the time being, to try and avoid confusion between the two. We should probably keep our distance, HFY mumbled, next to her friend and guardian. Her trunk nervously rolled up and fiddled with himself. Clearly, the sight of the other contender for her possible quasi-husband, at least if Admir understood that whole cultural dynamic correctly, had taken a good chunk out of her earlier boosted self-esteem.
That may be best,
Morgoth soon agreed with her. The Liga Mordular still protectively held the injured human soldier, cradled between his large digging claw and his chest, while his split ears waggled in slight tension as he watched the large ball basically part the uproaring crowds of the station with his presence alone. However, Admir's steps actually slowed in some surprise. The human eye was quite a bit sharper than that of either Zadiatos or Liga Mordular, so the lieutenant could see something that the Colossi likely only perceived as vague schemes at this distance, which was also partly due to the dark clothing. He quickly switched for a few comm channels. Are Councilman Levexa and Councilwoman Ajaxia currently with Nafmir Durulfren? He asked, slightly taken aback by what he spotted, which in turn caused his own VIPs to glance down at him, seemingly not quite believing what they heard. They are. He soon got the confirmation, giving him even more to wonder about. With both Zadiatos and Liga Mordular being quite hard to miss, it obviously didn't take long before their own Colossi were also spotted by the other group. Immediately, Levexa began waving wildly, which was most likely addressed towards Morgoth. Morgoth huffed for his nostrils.
What are they doing with that man?
He asked in a deep, suspicious tone, and almost immediately began to approach his old friend with firm, directed steps. While some soldiers already hurried after him, Admir turned his gaze up towards HFY. He hadn't missed her reaction earlier, and he remembered the stories James had told about the apparent relations between her and her father, the former Durulfren, that he had witnessed during his own detention on Osnajar. Of course, this was a different man, but it seemed like something about him still didn't sit right with her at all. Will you be okay? He asked her directly. Though it was unwise to split the party, he was worried about putting the young woman through any unnecessary distress in the already more than stressful situation. However, HFY quickly took a calming breath, and quite soon found her center. Yes, I'm fine, she assured him, lowering her large head while her trunk gave an appreciative gesture. I was just a bit surprised. Still, right after that, her trunk also moved to find that of her companion, quickly tangling with Durulfrens in a search for further reassurance. Admir nodded, and together with the rest of the soldiers that had stayed with them, he began to move, trying to catch up to the ones that had already hurried ahead, together with Morgoth. Nafmir Durulfren watched their approach like a hawk, his body tense as much as that of the younger bull had done earlier. Though unlike his supposed rival, he was not focused on the other bull. Instead, his eyes were glued to the vastly different Colossus, never leaving Morgoth, as the Liga Mordular hurried to the much smaller Vulpine, barely sparing a glance to the person staring daggers at him.
I am so glad to see you unharmed,
he exclaimed, with such genuine joy in his loud voice that it could really melt one's heart. He lowered himself slightly to speak to his friends more directly, though he was very careful to not accidentally disturb the human he was carrying through too many motions. Yeah, barely, Levexa quickly replied. He too sounded relieved, but his tone remained a good bit more grounded than that of the gentle giant. But we'll pull through. We had some surprising help, Ajaxia added onto his statement, before she briefly glanced over towards her unexpected company. Morgoth also gave the large ball a quite suspicious look.
I can see that,
he stated, his voice falling a bit flatter.
And he was very helpful?
Surprisingly so, Levexar confirmed, with a single wag of his tail. Still, despite that, he didn't seem to be very trusting of these Zodiatos exactly. Says Zodiatos now finally tore his many eyes away from the Class 5, and instead moved to approach his own conspecifics.
A sight for the will itself to see you stand unharmed, young matriarch,
he greeted her, moving one leg forwards to give an approximation of a deep bow. HFY still looked rather uncomfortable about his presence alone. However, she managed to conduct herself remarkably well despite that. Councilwoman, actually, she corrected him. Technically, both titles were probably correct, however one commanded far more authority. And I don't see why I would be harmed. These people do not have it out for people like you and I. They are after those not numerous enough in these parts to fight back against them. Nafmir Doralfen released an almost pitying breath as he lifted his head again.
These ruffians do not know the difference between carnivores and those speaking for them, he replied, in an almost lecturing tone that apparently pissed his rival Doralfen off quite a bit, as the younger bull's muscles tensed even more than before.
And in addition to them, far more unsavory figures are also prowling these streets, making use of the chaos. It seems all of the station's waste has come crawling from their holes today.
HFY huffed but kept her head high, and her voice dignified as she replied, Well, apart from a cheap shot, we have handled ourselves without further issue. Still, despite her demeanour, Admit can see her trunk tighten around that of her companion, and he highly suspected that the same was true for the Nafmir as well.
I would not have suspected any less,
Nafmir quickly assured her, lifting his trunk with his ends curled into an O shape. His tone at that moment could not have been more sucking up if he had tried.
But please, allow me to be delighted about your health either way. Who are we to not appreciate the natural things?
HFY visibly suppressed a sigh at his words, but apparently didn't deem it worth it to challenge them any further. Are you heading to the dock as well? She therefore diverted the conversation back to practicality. The Nafmir allowed his trunk to sink down and briefly turned his head to look in the direction of the station's wall.
Right now, the council member suggested that we either do that, or search for a defensible position to wait for further transport, provided by the humans, he explained,
his ears constant flapping picking up a bit. Hearing that, Amir glanced over at the leader of the other security team that was now joining up with his own. The other leaders shook their head. No news from transport so far. He once again activated his comms. Any prospect of a taxi? He asked, figuring by now some sort of transporter must have made his way down from the sun, down here. However, the answer he got was sobering. We can't get anything on the station right now. The airlocks are denying any request to land. An informative voice came out of his radio. Then, a moment later, the frequency was suddenly taken over as a more familiar voice pushed itself into the foreground. All units, Admiral Krieger's voice announced. If you are not ready to get into a direct firefight, do not directly approach any of the airlocks. Admir cocked an eyebrow as he stared down at the radio. Station security has orders to block any carnivores from leaving the station, the Admiral's voice continued. They see us as the hostiles of this situation. They will block you from passing, possibly worse. The airlocks will not be open for you. If possible, try to scout for possible unguarded airlocks, but do not engage. Removing the guards will not open the doors. Amir bit the inside of his cheek. Darn! Hunker down it is, he mumbled, but his eyes were immediately drawn to Morgoth and the injured he was carrying. How much time did he have left without professional help? Then his eyes moved up to the Zodiatos. A defensible position, with an enemy right at their midst, could become complicated. Then again, the guy didn't appear to be armed, and no matter how large he was, they already knew he was very much susceptible to bullets. Sam had proven that much. We best move together from here, he stated, getting a nod from the other team lead. More guns were better than fewer guns here.